Let's now cross live to that summit that's currently underway in Ekurhuleni's Birchwood Conference Centre.
Highlighting some of the headwinds that we are facing as the mining industry in the South African context. So if we just start off with the role of mining in the South African economy, I think a good place to start is on its contribution to growth. So if we look at GDP, or gross domestic product, as it stood back in 2017, for every 100 rand that was generated in terms of GDP, 8 rand came from the mining sector. But if we wind this back, and we look towards the 1960s, where that orange arrow is, you can see that the mining sector during the gold boom played a much more significant role in terms of GDP, at that stage contributing around 34 rand for every 100 rand of GDP. Taking it one step further and looking at the actual GDP growth rate, I've then looked at 4 key periods in history. So the first period is from where the data began in 1946, according to Stats SA's data, and I've taken that all the way through to 1982. Over that period, you can see that the red contribution to the chart, which is essentially the mining sector, was quite a healthy contribution at around 1.2%. Then what followed in South Africa was a lost decade of growth. And that was really between 1983 and 1993, where GDP growth in South Africa was at a standstill. In real terms, we averaged around 0%. During that period, mining's contribution also suffered, and you can see the mining contribution to GDP growth fell to 0.1%. The third period I want to focus on is on a post-democratic era, so 1994 right up until the 2007 global financial crisis, and there was some recovery in terms of the GDP output from the mining sector. Then, of course, the world got slapped by the global financial crisis, and South Africa was in on that as well, and as a result we saw that mining never really got back to its pre-crisis levels. So since the 2008 global financial crisis, the contribution that came through from the mining sector to overall growth fell back to 0.1%, very similar to the same period of the last decade of growth that we experienced in South Africa in the late 80s. Nevertheless, even though the mining contribution to growth has fallen, mining still contributes quite a significant amount to capital expenditure, or what we call CapEx. So every 100 rand that is spent on capital in South Africa, of that 100 rand, 9 rand comes from the mining sector. And despite what you've seen in terms of the GDP contribution over the different periods, over the periods here from long-term 1946, or whether you look at it on a post-democratic period from 94, or even more recently from the 2008 global financial crisis, or even more recently and looking at it over the last 3 years, you can see that that contribution to overall fixed investment, its share has remained relatively steady. This, however, gives us a little bit of a false picture, because if we look at the growth rate in fixed investment for the past 3 years, on the right-hand side of the chart, you can see that the red bar is missing. That's because there was 0 real fixed investment growth in the South African economy on average for the past 3 years. This was really dragged lower by the mining sector, which contracted by 4.6% on average every year for the past 3 years. And this has also had spillover effects into industries like manufacturing, construction and transport, where capital expenditure over the last 3 years was negative there as well. Mining plays a huge role in terms of our export revenues. So out of every 100 rand of exports that are generated in South Africa, 40 rand essentially comes from the mining industry. Mining also plays a significant role in terms of our tax collections. So if we look at the data from 2015 from SARS and National Treasury, out of every 100 rand that we collected in terms of corporate taxes, about 6 rand came directly from the mining sector. The mining sector also has its role to play in terms of creating employment in South Africa. And if you see where that orange line is, unfortunately, we don't have data from Stats SA that is comparable beyond 2008. But essentially, since the global financial crisis, the mining share of total employment in South Africa has been quite low. So for every 100 jobs there are in South Africa, the mining sector directly contributes around 3 jobs, although numerous studies suggest that for every 1 job that is created in the mining sector, 2 indirect jobs are also created as a positive spillover effect. So one could make the argument that for every 100 jobs in South Africa, there are around 9 jobs that are mining related, which makes it a more healthier contribution. Since the global financial crisis, or roughly for the past decade, we've only seen 44,000 jobs being created in the mining sector. This is quite low in comparison to the total employment that has been created in the economy since the global financial crisis, which was closer to 918,000 jobs. So that is 44,000 jobs out of a total quantum of 918,000 jobs. The real culprit here has been the employment shedding in the gold sector, and as you can see, bar a very small period in 2015, for the data since 2010, the gold sector has been continuously shedding jobs. So those 44,000 jobs that have been created more recently have essentially come from the non-gold mining sectors in the South African economy. The second part of the presentation just deals with South Africa's competitiveness of the mining industry relative to a global scale. And here I've used data from the Fraser Institute on the 2017 survey, and it basically suggests that South Africa's investment attractiveness is pretty much mid of the range. Now, that investment attractiveness index is made up of 2 components. The one is the mineral potential, so the geological potential of South Africa, which has actually increased for South Africa over the last 5 years, whereas the second component, which is the attractiveness of mining policies, has been a one-way downward bet in South Africa since 2013. I think one of the reasons that our mineral potential is quite high, and Kateko touched on this earlier, is that South Africa does boast very healthy mineral reserves. We are making up around 90% of the world's total PGM reserves. According to Stats SA, we have about 240 years worth of mining PGMs in South Africa. Gold has fallen a little bit down the scale, so we have only 39 years left worth of reserves, again, according to Stats SA, making up around 11–12% of the total world reserves. What is a little bit more of a potential for South Africans is the coal industry, where we currently have around 116 years of reserves worth of mining. The detail from the Fraser Institute also highlighted that South Africa stacked up favorably against a number of other economies based on some of the advantages, but we also face a number of challenges that put us on the back foot. In terms of our advantages relative to other countries that are surveyed in this particular Fraser Institute survey, we rank favorably on the certainty around environmental regulation and protected areas. We have a good quality of infrastructure, a lack of trade barriers, a good geological database, and enough skills and labor to support the mining industry. However, South Africa falls flat on a number of measures, including a lack of community development, and I think this was really post-2012 on the Marikana tragedy that occurred. We never really rectified this issue. Disputed land claims, problems with our taxation and legal regimes, regulatory uncertainty, and we stacked up very poorly on political stability. We were, in fact, the 3rd worst from all the countries that are ranked by the Fraser Institute, and also quite poorly on security issues. We were the 5th worst from all the countries that the Fraser Institute surveyed. Lastly, I just want to touch on the headwinds that are currently facing the South African mining industry. First of all, I think we are in for a slower commodity price environment. We look at the US dollar relative to commodity prices, and whenever we have a strengthening US dollar environment, which we currently have, this chart suggests that we are in for a period of weaker commodity prices. We believe that the US dollar is likely to remain strong in an environment where they are embarking on quantitative tightening relative to the Eurozone, which has now extended its period of quantitative easing. The growth differentials and interest differentials are also currently stacking up in favor of the US relative to the Eurozone, suggesting that the dollar is likely to remain firm. If we take into account some of the key commodities that South Africa looks at, its underperformance in rand terms has been quite evident. So outside of the platinum and iron ore industries, things like gold, magnesium, chrome, and coal relative to 2013 are in fact around 25 to 50% lower than where we were 5 years ago. The second key headwind to the South African mining industry is slowing Chinese demand. We believe that there's an active deleveraging campaign taking place in China, which means that they are firmly clamping down on credit growth. That credit growth, which essentially filters into infrastructure, suggests that infrastructure growth has been falling off a cliff lately. This bodes ill for South Africans because we export those mining minerals and commodities that are used in infrastructure spend in China. China's rebalancing is currently underway, and they are making a firm attempt to move away from investment spend. So as you can see, the red portions of those bars are declining since 2008, making a smaller contribution to growth from investment, while Chinese are now hell-bent on trying to promote consumption in their economy. This is not going to be positive for South Africa's terms of trade because the commodities that we export to the Chinese are for infrastructure spend and not really for their consumer demand. At this point in time, we don't really know who's going to replace China's staggering demand for commodities if they continue to clamp down on liquidity and on credit growth. As you can see from this chart, more than half of the steel, copper, coal, and nickel and cement actually is destined for China in terms of total world demand. While India is a close second, it will still take them a number of years to get to the position where they will demand the same quantum of commodities that China is currently demanding in the world. The third key headwind is profitability, and here I've looked at data from the South African Reserve Bank, but for the past 3 years, and again indicated by the orange arrow over there, the mining sector on average has had negative rates of profitability. I think part of this is because of a high cost base. So if we look at the electricity costs, in year on year, the inflation here has been around 9.3% on average every year since January 2013. That is far in excess of headline inflation. Add to that, they've had a very high wage cost base. So if we look at the real wages that have been awarded to the mining sector since the global financial crisis, this has been at 4%. So this is after we take out the impact of inflation, and you can see it's pretty much the highest on this ranking after we strip out the government wages in the government sector and the utility sector. So companies have really come under pressure from lower commodity prices in rand terms and a very high cost base created by an increase in electricity prices and higher real wage growth. Mining firms have also had to contend with an enormous amount of labor unrest. And here this is data from the Department of Labor, which shows us a very large number of working days lost due to strikes in the mining sector. And this is done in millions. So you can see that for 2016, over 200,000 working days were essentially lost. Lastly, the key headwind to the mining sector in South Africa remains policy uncertainty or political uncertainty more broadly, as well as insufficient demand. So really we are trying to make the point that we do not need to see another rehash of the mining charter. There seems to be a lot of pushback in terms of the political uncertainty that's playing out and a bit of an investment strike from external investors. The Bureau of Economic Research has conducted a survey where they asked respondents why don't they want to put in new capital expenditure, and over 3/4 of them have said it's because there is policy uncertainty playing out and they're not quite sure which way this is going to go, so they would rather wait on their fixed investment plans. Another 3/4 of them also said that there's just not enough demand in the economy, and of course the likelihood of the Chinese demand slowing will add to this concern. So in summary, I do think South Africa does rank very highly on the Mineral Potential Index. We have very healthy reserves. Even though the mining sector contribution to growth has been declining in previous decades, it is still a massive contributor to export revenues, tax revenues, and employment once you take into account direct and indirect employment. And we know that the mining industry is very vital to the livelihoods of the communities that depend on this industry in a number of provinces. So this does enable a decline in inequality and poverty. However, we are facing significant challenges, such as the high input costs that were created by real wages and electricity, just to name a few. We know that there hasn't been enough capital expenditure in this particular sector because of the high levels of policy uncertainty. And lastly, we are also battling with global headwinds, such as a potential decline in commodity prices because the Chinese economy is slowing and because we are facing an environment of a firmer dollar. Thank you very much for your time.